Are you lost too, mister? No, but I'll stay right here with you until we find your family.
A 6'4" Hell's Angel, scarred leather-clad and wearing the infamous Death's Head patch, isn't someone you approach. But when a lost, tearful 5-year-old girl tugged on his heavy vest and asked one simple question, the rugged biker's reaction didn't just shock the crowd, it left the entire park in tears. Arthur Grizz Hayes sat on a weathered wooden bench in the center of Centennial Park, an imposing mountain of a man who looked entirely out of place among the sun-drenched picnickers and laughing children. At 58, Arthur had the map of a hard life etched into his face. Deep creases framed eyes that were a cold, piercing steel gray, and a thick, graying beard cascaded over the top of his heavy leather cut. On his back, the iconic winged Death's Head of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club was stitched with defiant pride, bordered by the bright red and white top and bottom rockers that declared his allegiance and his territory. To the yuppie parents pushing $3,000 strollers and the young couples sipping artisanal lattes, Arthur was a terrifying spectacle. He was an interloper in their pristine suburban sanctuary. Mothers subtly pulled their toddlers closer as they walked past. Fathers puffed out their chests but diverted their eyes, pretending not to notice the giant biker with knuckles covered in faded prison ink. Arthur didn't care. He was used to the whispers. He was used to being the wolf in the sheep's pasture. He had ridden his customized Harley-Davidson Panhead 300 miles that morning just to sit on this specific bench. It was the 7th of October. Exactly 5 years ago to the day, his best friend and club brother, Bobby Torch Henderson, had been forced off a winding mountain highway by a reckless semi-truck driver. Bobby hadn't survived. The grief was a heavy, suffocating blanket that Arthur wore beneath his leather. Before Bobby died, he had been arguing with his fiancée, Clara. Clara had hated the MC life. She had begged Bobby to leave the Hells Angels, to turn in his patch and move away to start a quiet family. She had been 3 months pregnant at the time of the crash. After the funeral, a devastated and bitter Clara had packed up her life and vanished. No forwarding address, no phone calls. She had severed all ties with the club, blaming them and Arthur, who was the chapter president at the time for the lifestyle that ultimately put Bobby in an early grave. Arthur stared at the ducks, gliding across the man-made pond, his massive, heavy-booted feet planted firmly on the concrete. The roar of the city felt distant. He was lost in a sea of ghosts, wondering if Clara ever had the baby, wondering what that child looked like, wondering if Bobby's legacy was out there somewhere in the world, completely unaware of the brotherhood that would have laid down their lives for them. That was when he felt it. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible tug on the heavy denim of his jeans, right below the hem of his leather vest. Arthur slowly turned his massive head, his brow furrowing in irritation. He expected to see a bold teenager pulling a prank, or perhaps a stray dog. Instead, his steely gaze dropped down to meet a pair of wide, watery blue eyes. Standing there was a little girl, no older than 5. She was swallowed up in a pink, oversized sweater, her blonde hair pulled into 2 messy pigtails. One of her knees was badly scraped, a thin trail of dried blood winding down to her light-up sneakers. In her arms, she clutched a dirt-smudged, stuffed elephant with one missing button eye. The park around them seemed to collectively hold its breath. A woman a few yards away gasped audibly, dropping her phone into her purse. 2 men in polo shirts stopped dead in their tracks, looking as though they were debating whether to intervene or run. Approaching a fully patched Hells Angel was an unspoken taboo. Letting your child touch one was unthinkable. Arthur froze. For a man who had stared down rival gangs, negotiated truces in dimly lit basements, and survived 3 separate tours in maximum security lockups, he was entirely paralyzed by the 5-year-old girl looking up at him. She sniffled, wiping a streak of dirt and tears across her cheek with the back of her small hand. She looked at his heavy boots, up his denim-clad legs, past the intimidating Death's Head patch, and finally met his eyes. "Are you lost too, mister?" she asked. Her voice was barely a whisper, trembling like a leaf in a storm, but in the quiet tension of the park, it echoed like a gunshot. Arthur's heart, hardened by decades of violence and loss, felt as though it had been physically struck. The sheer innocence of the question, the total absence of the fear and judgment he received from every other living soul in the park, shattered the wall he had built around himself. She didn't see a monster. She didn't see a criminal or a threat. She just saw a big, sad man sitting alone on a bench. Arthur cleared his throat. The sound a deep, gravelly rumble that made the nearby onlookers flinch. He slowly leaned forward, resting his massive, heavily tattooed forearms on his knees so he was closer to her eye level. He made sure to keep his movements deliberate and slow, like approaching a wild fawn. "I think maybe I am, little one," Arthur said, his voice surprisingly soft, a stark contrast to his terrifying exterior. "But it looks to me like you're a lot more lost than I am. Where's your mama?" The little girl's lower lip quivered, and a fresh wave of tears spilled over her eyelashes. "I was looking at the ducks," she sobbed, clutching the stuffed elephant tighter to her chest. "And then I turned around, and Mommy was gone. I can't find her." Arthur sighed, a slow, heavy exhalation. He looked around the park. The bystanders were still watching, whispering to one another, but not a single one of the respectable citizens had stepped up to help the crying child before she wandered over to the scariest man in the vicinity. The hypocrisy tasted sour in Arthur's mouth. They were more interested in the spectacle than the safety of a little girl. "All right," Arthur said softly. "Don't you cry now. My name's Arthur. My friends call me Grizz. What's your name?" "Chloe," she whimpered. "Well, Chloe," Arthur said, offering her a fleeting, crooked smile. "You're in luck. I happen to be exceptionally good at finding things. How about we go find your mama?" Chloe looked at him, her tear-filled blue eyes searching his scarred face. Despite the leather, the chains, and the intimidating patches, a child's intuition is rarely wrong. She sensed the profound, protective sadness emanating from the giant man. Slowly, she nodded, reaching out her tiny, sticky hand. Arthur hesitated. He stared at her hand for a long moment. It had been over 20 years since his own daughter had grown too old to hold his hand, and the sheer vulnerability of the gesture hit him like a physical blow. Gently, almost reverently, Arthur wrapped his massive, calloused fingers bearing the fading tattoos of skulls and crossbones around Chloe's tiny hand. As Arthur stood up to his full 6'4" height, the surrounding crowd actively parted. A woman with a terrified expression pulled her golden retriever back on its leash. A man in a tailored suit frantically dialed a number on his cell phone, his eyes darting toward Arthur. Arthur knew exactly what was happening. They were calling the police. A Hell's Angel walking off with a little girl was a nightmare scenario for these suburbanites. "Let them call," Arthur thought grimly. "The cops can help find her mother faster anyway." "Where did you last see her, Chloe?" Arthur asked, adjusting his pace to match her tiny, shuffling steps. "By the ice cream truck." Chloe sniffled, pointing her stuffed elephant toward the far side of the park. Arthur nodded. Then we marched to the ice cream truck. As they walked, Arthur realized the silence between them was making Chloe nervous. He needed to distract her. He racked his brain, trying to remember how to talk to a 5-year-old. "So?" Arthur rumbled gently. "What's the elephant's name?" Chloe looked down at her toy, Mr. Peanut. "But he lost his eye when we moved to our new house." "Mr. Peanut has seen some battles," Arthur chuckled softly. "I've got a few missing pieces myself. It builds character." Chloe looked up at his vest, her eyes tracing the bright red and white embroidery of his patches. "My daddy has a jacket like yours," she said innocently. Arthur felt a slight chill run down his spine, though he brushed it off. Motorcycle jackets were common enough. "Is that right?" "He rides a motorcycle?" "Uh-huh. A really loud one," Chloe said, wiping her nose. "He has a skull on the back, just like yours, but it has wings." Arthur stopped dead in his tracks. His heavy boot ground into the gravel path. His grip on Chloe's hand tightened fractionally, just enough to secure her, but not enough to hurt. The breath caught in his throat, and the distant sounds of the park, the rustling leaves, the splashing fountain, the distant sirens seemed to fade into a vacuum. A skull with wings. The death's head. "Chloe," Arthur said, his voice suddenly thick, a tremor betraying his hardened exterior. He dropped down to one knee again, ignoring the sharp pain in his joints. bringing himself eye to eye with the girl. "What did you say?" "My daddy has a jacket with a skull and wings," she repeated, looking at him with mild confusion. "Mommy keeps it in a big box in the closet." She cries when she looks at it. Arthur's heart began to hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. There were thousands of Hell's Angels across the world. It was a massive club. It could be a coincidence. It could be a former member from a different state. It could be anyone. "Chloe," Arthur swallowed hard, his throat dry as bone dust. What is your daddy's name?" Chloe looked down at her light-up sneakers. "I don't know his real name. Mommy just calls him Robert, but his friends called him Torch. Mommy told me that means he was really fast." The earth seemed to fall away from beneath Arthur's feet. Torch. Robert Torch Henderson. Arthur stared at the little girl, his vision suddenly blurring. He looked at her blonde hair, messy and bright in the afternoon sun. He looked at her eyes, that specific, piercing shade of blue. He hadn't noticed it before because of the tears, but looking at her now, it was undeniable. It was like looking into the face of a ghost. She had Bobby's eyes. She had his crooked little nose. This was the baby. This was the child Clara had taken away. Bobby's daughter. Arthur couldn't breathe. 5 years. 5 years of wondering, of searching cold trails, of living with the guilt that he couldn't protect his brother, and now, by some impossible divine orchestration of the universe, Bobby's little girl had walked right up to him, in a park of 1,000 people, and grabbed his vest. "Torch!" Arthur choked out, a single hot tear breaking free and carving a clean path down his dusty, weathered cheek. He quickly wiped it away with the back of his massive, leather-clad arm, but he couldn't stop the trembling in his hands. "Are you okay, mister?" Chloe asked, stepping closer, reaching out to pat his huge, tattooed shoulder. "Are you crying?" "No, sweetheart," Arthur lied, his voice cracking violently. He let out a wet, shaky laugh, pulling his sunglasses down from the top of his head to cover his eyes. "No, Grizz just got some dust in his eyes. Just some dust." He looked at the little girl, the legacy of the man who had died in his arms on that mountain road. A fierce, overwhelming wave of protective love washed over him, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees for a second time. He had sworn to Bobby, as he bled out on the asphalt, that he would look after his family. And he had failed. Until today. Before Arthur could say another word, the wail of police sirens cut through the air, much closer now. A pair of park security golf carts, flanked by 2 local police cruisers, came skidding onto the paved path, just 50 yards away. The bystanders who had been filming them immediately began pointing frantically at Arthur. "There he is! He took her!" a woman shrieked from the safety of a nearby gazebo. 3 police officers leaped out of their vehicles, hands resting cautiously on their holstered weapons. They had gotten a call about a large, heavily tattooed biker kidnapping a child. Given Arthur's colors, they were approaching the situation with maximum hostility. "Hey, you! Step away from the little girl!" the lead officer barked, drawing his taser and pointing it squarely at Arthur's chest. "Keep your hands where I can see them. Now!" Arthur slowly stood up. His instincts, honed by decades of outlaw life, screamed at him to bow up, to get defensive, to curse out the badges who were pointing weapons at him in a public park. But then he felt Chloe whimpering, terrified by the sudden shouting and the police cars. She shrank behind Arthur's massive leg, clutching his jeans. Arthur looked at the officers. He looked at the screaming crowd. And then he looked down at his brother's daughter. He wasn't a Hell's Angel in that moment. He wasn't a nomad, or a hardened criminal, or a terrifying specter of the highway. He was just an uncle protecting his niece. Arthur slowly raised both of his massive hands in the air, open-palmed, offering zero resistance. He didn't sneer. He didn't swear. "Take it easy, officers," Arthur shouted back, his voice remarkably calm and steady, projecting across the lawn. "She's just lost. We're looking for her mother. Her name is Clara. Clara Henderson, please, just help me find her mother." The lead officer paused, his finger hovering over the trigger of his taser, clearly caught off guard by the biker's total surrender and polite tone. From behind the police cruisers, a frantic, hysterical voice shattered the standoff. "Chloe, "Oh my God, Chloe." A woman came tearing through the line of police officers, looking frantic and disheveled. She was weeping hysterically, her eyes scanning the park until they locked onto the little girl hiding behind the giant biker. Arthur lowered his hands slowly. He recognized her instantly, even though the last 5 years had aged her. It was Clara. Clara froze as she broke past the cops. Her eyes darted from Chloe to the massive man shielding her. She took in the heavy leather boots, the denim, and finally, the bearded face of Arthur Grizz Hayes. The color drained from her face, turning her completely ashen. She stopped 10 feet away, paralyzed by a combination of shock, fear, and disbelief. "Arthur?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Hello, Clara," Arthur said softly, his voice full of an aching, gentle sorrow. He reached down, gently guiding Chloe out from behind his leg and giving her a soft nudge toward her mother. "I think someone is looking for you." Clara hit the gravel path with bone-jarring force, completely ignoring the sharp sting in her knees as she wrapped her arms around Chloe. She pulled the little girl tightly against her chest, burying her face in her daughter's blonde hair. Her sobs were raw, echoing with 5 years of pent-up terror and exhaustion. Chloe, safe but thoroughly overwhelmed by her mother's sudden emotional collapse, hugged her stuffed elephant and patted Clara's back with a small, dirty hand. The police officers remained perfectly still, their hands resting on their utility belts, clearly confused by the unfolding scene. The imposing Hell's Angel had not only surrendered peacefully, but had seemingly orchestrated the reunion. "Ma'am." The lead officer, a young man with a tight buzz cut and a name tag that read Harrison, stepped forward cautiously. "Ma'am, do you know this man? Did he try to take your daughter?" Clara slowly lifted her head, her eyes, red-rimmed and swollen, locked onto Arthur. He stood a few paces away, giving her space, his massive arms crossed loosely over the front of his leather vest. The death's head patch on his chest seemed to mock her, a vivid reminder of the life she had desperately fled. Yet, looking into Arthur's steely gray eyes, she saw no malice. She saw the same profound, shattering grief that she saw in the mirror every single morning. "No," Clara choked out, her voice trembling as she wiped her face. She pulled Chloe closer, standing up slowly. "No, officer. He didn't take her. He's an old friend of my late husband. He was just keeping her safe." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the remaining onlookers. Officer Harrison frowned, looking Arthur up and down, his gaze lingering on the faded prison ink decorating the biker's knuckles. "Are you absolutely sure, ma'am? We received multiple calls about a suspect matching his description, forcibly leading the child away." Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't offer a defense. He simply waited, letting Clara dictate the narrative. He knew how the law viewed his patch, and he knew that protesting would only escalate the situation. "I'm sure," Clara said, her tone suddenly hardening with a mother's definitive authority. "My daughter wandered off. He found her. That's all that happened here." The officers exchanged skeptical glances, but without a pressing charge from the mother, their hands were tied. Harrison gave Arthur a hard, warning glare. "We're going to clear out, but I strongly suggest you move along, sir. You're causing a disturbance just by being here." "Understood, boss," Arthur rumbled smoothly, offering a slow, deliberate nod. As the police retreated to their cruisers and the disappointed crowd slowly dispersed, returning to their picnics and jogging paths, a heavy, suffocating silence fell between the three of them. The tension was thick enough to cut with a hunting knife. "Chloe, honey," Clara whispered, kneeling back down to her daughter's level. "I need you to go sit on that bench right there for 2 minutes, okay? Mommy needs to talk to her old friend." Chloe nodded obediently, clutching Mr. Peanut as she shuffled over to the wooden bench Arthur had occupied just minutes prior. Once the little girl was out of earshot, Clara turned on Arthur. The sheer relief of finding her daughter vanished, instantly replaced by a fierce, defensive anger. She marched up to him, entirely fearless despite the massive height and weight disparity. "How did you find us, Arthur?" she hissed, her voice venomous, dropping to a harsh whisper. "Did you put a tail on me? Did the club track my credit cards? Tell me the truth." Arthur looked down at her, his expression softening into one of deep sorrow. "Clara, I haven't looked for you in 4 years. Not since you sent that letter threatening to call the feds if the club ever reached out again. I respected your wishes. I backed off. Then what are you doing here? She demanded, pointing an accusatory finger at his broad chest. In my city? In my local park? You expect me to believe this is a coincidence? Arthur slowly reached into the pocket of his denim jacket. Clara flinched, instinctively taking a half step back, but Arthur only produced a battered, silver Zippo lighter. He turned it over in his massive hands. Engraved on the polished metal was a simple phrase: to torch. Keep the fire burning. Look at a calendar, Clara, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. It's October 7th. Clara froze. The anger drained from her face, leaving behind a hollow, devastating pallor. 5 years today, Arthur continued, his eyes drifting away from her, staring across the man-made pond. Bobby and I used to ride through this county when we were prospects. We'd stop at this exact park to stretch our legs. I rode 300 miles this morning just to sit on that bench and have a quiet beer for my brother. I didn't find you, Clara, your little girl. She found me. Clara covered her mouth with trembling hands, a stifled sob escaping her lips. The sheer, impossible weight of the coincidence, the divine, heartbreaking alignment of fate, was too much to bear. She turned away, wrapping her arms tightly around her own torso, as if trying to hold herself together. She has his eyes, Arthur said softly, stepping a fraction closer. She has his exact eyes. Clara, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you let the club help you? We would have taken care of you both. You would never have wanted for anything. Bobby was our blood. Clara spun around, her eyes flashing with a sudden, desperate fire. Because your blood is exactly what I was trying to protect her from, Grizz. You think I just hated the leather and the loud pipes? You think I ran away just because I didn't like the lifestyle? Arthur frowned, the deep creases in his forehead deepening. You blamed the MC for the crash. You said the life distracted him. I lied, Clara shouted, her voice cracking, drawing a few concerned glances from a distant family, though she no longer cared. Tears streamed freely down her pale cheeks. I lied to you, Arthur. I lied to the police. I lied to everyone, because I was terrified. Arthur's posture subtly shifted. The weary, grieving old biker vanished, instantly replaced by the hardened, hyper-alert former president of the Hells Angels. His eyes narrowed, scanning the park perimeter out of sheer instinct. Terrified of what, Clara? Talk to me. Clara took a shuddering breath, looking over at Chloe, who was happily swinging her legs on the bench, completely oblivious to the earth-shattering conversation happening a few yards away. Bobby didn't just run off the road, Arthur, Clara whispered, the words tumbling out as if they burned her throat. It wasn't an accident. And it wasn't a drunk truck driver. The park around Arthur seemed to plunge into a vacuum. The distant laughter of children, the splashing fountain, the gentle rustle of autumn, leaves it all muted, fading behind the sudden, roaring rush of blood in his ears. Not an accident. For 5 years, Arthur had tortured himself with the belief that a random, chaotic twist of fate had robbed him of his best friend. He had spent countless sleepless nights agonizing over the senselessness of it all. To hear that it was deliberate, that someone had actively taken Bobby from the world, ignited a cold, dormant fury deep within the marrow of his bones. Explain, Arthur commanded. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a deadly, absolute authority that made Clara shiver. About a month before the crash, Bobby started acting paranoid, Clara began, her voice trembling, her arms still wrapped tightly around herself. He was staying up late, going through shipping manifests from the auto shop. He told me he found something buried in the books, something the club didn't know about. Arthur's mind raced. The MC ran several legitimate motorcycle repair and custom fabrication shops across the state. They were clean businesses, meant to provide steady income and a legal front for the members. What did he find? Someone was using the club's freight trucks to move something else, Clara whispered, her eyes darting around as if ghosts were listening in the trees. Something heavy. Bobby said it was a crew out of the city, the Croft Syndicate. They had paid off one of your newer patches to look the other way while they moved weapons across state lines under the Hells Angels banner. Arthur's jaw tightened so hard his teeth audibly ground together. Silas Croft, he knew the name. Croft ran a ruthless, heavily armed operation out of the shipping docks. If the ATF or the FBI had caught Croft's guns in a Hells Angels truck, the entire charter would have been raided. Everyone would have gone down under federal RICO charges. Bobby had stumbled onto a betrayal that could have destroyed the entire brotherhood. "Bobby was going to come to you," Clara sobbed, wiping her face frantically. He gathered the ledgers. He put them in a duffel bag and told me he was riding out to the clubhouse to show you everything, to root out the rat. But he never made it. Arthur closed his eyes, a sickening wave of realization washing over him. The winding mountain highway, the sheer drop, the unidentified semi-truck that clipped Bobby's Harley and forced him over the edge. It was a hit. Croft's people had intercepted him before he could expose the operation. After the funeral, Clara continued, her voice dropping to a desperate rasp. "A man cornered me in the grocery store parking lot. He didn't look like a biker. He wore a nice suit. He told me that Bobby was a casualty of business. He said that if I ever breathed a word to you or the police about the ledgers, or about Croft, they would kill me, and they would kill my unborn baby." Clara looked up at Arthur, her chest heaving, years of suffocating terror finally breaking the dam. "What was I supposed to do, Grizz? If I told you, you would have gone to war. The club would have hit the streets, bullets would have started flying, and Silas Croft would have made good on his promise. I had to choose between avenging my husband or saving his child, so I ran. I changed my name, I moved 3 states away, and I hid." Arthur stood perfectly still, absorbing the sheer magnitude of her sacrifice. Clara hadn't betrayed the club. She hadn't hated them. She had lived in absolute agonizing exile for 5 years to protect Bobby's daughter from a ruthless syndicate, carrying the heavy secret entirely on her own shoulders. Slowly, Arthur reached out. He placed his massive, heavy hands gently on Clara's shoulders. The leather of his gloves creaked softly. "You did the right thing, Clara," Arthur said, his voice remarkably gentle, a stark contrast to the violent storm raging behind his gray eyes. "You protected the blood. Bobby would have been so damn proud of you." "I am proud of you." Clara let out a broken gasp, the validation finally shattering her remaining defenses. She leaned forward, burying her face against the heavy leather of Arthur's cut, crying into the death's head patch she had feared for so long. Arthur wrapped his massive arms around her, holding her securely, a silent promise of impenetrable protection. "But Croft, he's still out there," Clara mumbled against his chest. "If they find out, if they see you with me." Arthur slowly pulled back, looking Clara dead in the eye. The warmth in his gaze vanished, replaced by the terrifying, cold calculation of an apex predator. "Silas Croft is a dead man walking," Arthur stated, the words carrying the finality of a judge's gavel. "He put his hands on my club. He murdered my brother, and he threatened my niece. You don't have to look over your shoulder ever again, Clara. I'm going to make sure the Croft syndicate is wiped off the map. Quietly. Permanently. The club will handle it, and no one will ever trace it back to you." Clara looked at him, seeing the undeniable truth in his eyes. For the first time in 5 years, the heavy, suffocating knot of fear in her chest began to loosen. She wasn't alone anymore. "Mommy?" Arthur and Clara both turned. Chloe had wandered back over, holding Mr. Peanut by his trunk. She looked up at the giant biker, then at her mother's tear-stained face. "Are we going home now?" Chloe asked innocently. Arthur knelt down again, his knees popping in protest. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small, heavy silver bell. It was a guardian bell, a traditional token bikers gave to one another to ward off evil road spirits. He held it out on his thick, scarred palm. "Chloe," Arthur smiled, a genuine, warm expression that entirely transformed his rugged face. "I have something for you. A friend of mine gave this to me a long time ago to keep me safe. I want you to have it now." Chloe's eyes lit up. She carefully picked up the silver bell, shaking it gently to hear its soft, clear chime. "Thank you, Mr. Grizz." "You don't have to call me Mr. Grizz, little one," Arthur said softly, his voice thick with emotion. He glanced up at Clara, seeking permission. Clara offered a watery, grateful smile and nodded. Arthur looked back at the little girl who shared his best friend's eyes. "You can call me Uncle Arthur." Chloe smiled, a bright, radiant expression that seemed to chase away the lingering shadows of the park. She stepped forward and threw her tiny arms around Arthur's massive, leather-clad neck, hugging him tight. Arthur closed his eyes, gently wrapping one huge arm around her small back, feeling the broken pieces of his heart finally begin to mend. The ghost on the bench was gone. In its place was a promise written in blood, iron, and an unbreakable bond that even death couldn't sever. Silas Croft had no idea what was coming for him. But as Arthur held his niece, he knew one thing for certain. The Hells Angels were going to rain hellfire on the city, and Bobby's daughter would never live in fear again. Arthur didn't ride back to his empty apartment that afternoon. He fired up his panhead and rode straight to the clubhouse, a fortified compound on the industrial outskirts of the city. As the heavy iron gates swung open, the familiar roar of V-twin engines and the scent of gasoline and stale beer greeted him. But Arthur wasn't there for brotherhood and beers. He was there for war. He called a meeting immediately, summoning every fully patched member to the long, scarred wooden table in the chapter's secure back room. When Arthur told them the truth that Bobby Torch Henderson hadn't died by accident, but had been murdered by Silas Croft's syndicate to cover up their illicit gun running through the club's legitimate fronts, the room erupted. Chairs were kicked over. Heavy, ringed fists slammed against the table. The younger members demanded blood immediately, ready to strap up and ride to the shipping docks to burn Croft's operation to the ground. But Arthur raised a single, massive hand, and the room fell dead silent. "We don't ride in like a street gang," Arthur rumbled, his voice cold and calculated. "Croft thinks he's a businessman. We are going to dismantle his business. We take his money, we take his supply, and we leave him to the wolves. Clara and the girl need to remain completely out of this. They are ghosts, understand?" The men nodded in grim unison. The Hells Angels were not just a motorcycle club. They were a highly organized, tightly knit machine, and when motivated by the blood of a fallen brother, they were unstoppable. Over the next 3 weeks, the Croft Syndicate was systematically dismantled. It was a masterpiece of outlaw precision. Croft's illicit shipments began to vanish from the highways. His secure warehouses at the docks were emptied in the dead of night. The illegal weapons melted down to slag in the MC's auto shop furnaces. His lieutenants, suddenly finding themselves completely cut off from their money and their muscle, began to panic and turn on one another. The final blow came on a rainy Tuesday night. Silas Croft, paranoid and hemorrhaging money, retreated to his heavily guarded suburban estate. But no amount of private security could stop a ghost. Croft awoke to find Arthur sitting in the leather armchair at the foot of his bed. Arthur didn't have a weapon drawn. He simply sat there, a towering shadow illuminated only by the moonlight, filtering through the window, smoking a cigar. "Your operation is done, Silas," Arthur said quietly. Croft lunged for the panic button on his nightstand, but the wires had already been cut. He scrambled back against the headboard, trembling in his expensive silk pajamas. "The feds received a package an hour ago," Arthur continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "Ledgers, shipping manifests, bank routing numbers, everything Bobby found 5 years ago, plus everything my boys dug up this month. They'll be here in 10 minutes. You're a dead man," Croft spat, though his voice cracked with terror. Arthur slowly stood up, letting the ember of his cigar glow in the dark. "My brother is dead, but his club is still breathing. You enjoy federal prison, Silas." By the time the FBI raided the estate, Arthur was long gone, blending back into the midnight highway. Silas Croft was indicted on 74 counts of racketeering, weapons trafficking, and conspiracy. He was denied bail, and the syndicate crumbled to dust. The threat was erased, permanently. 6 months later, the bitter chill of autumn had surrendered to the gentle warmth of spring. Arthur pulled his Harley to a stop outside a neat, white picket fence house in a quiet neighborhood. He cut the engine, the sudden silence filled by the sound of chirping birds. He hadn't worn his leather cut today. Instead, he wore a simple black flannel shirt and clean jeans. The front door burst open before he even reached the porch. "Uncle Arthur," Chloe flew down the steps, her light-up sneakers flashing in the sunlight. Arthur braced himself, catching the little girl and hoisting her up onto his broad shoulders with a deep, rumbling laugh. She was still clutching Mr. Peanut, though the elephant now sported a shiny new button eye that Arthur had clumsily sewn on himself a few weeks prior. Clara walked out onto the porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She looked completely different. The hollow, hunted look in her eyes was gone. She was radiant, smiling warmly as she watched the giant biker twirl her daughter around the front yard. "You're right on time, Grizz," Clara called out. "I made a pie. Apple, your favorite." "Wouldn't miss it, Clara," Arthur smiled, setting Chloe down gently. Before they went inside, Arthur looked down at Chloe. "Hey, Squirt, you still have that bell I gave you?" Chloe reached into the pocket of her denim overalls and pulled out the silver Guardian bell, ringing it proudly. "I keep it right here. It keeps the bad things away." Arthur knelt down, placing his large hand over hers. "That's right. It does. But you remember what I told you?" Chloe nodded solemnly, her bright blue eyes, Bobby's eyes, looking right into his soul. "I don't just need a bell. I have you." Arthur smiled, a profound, unshakable peace settling over his weary heart. The ghosts of his past had finally been laid to rest. He had lost his best friend on that mountain road, but he had found something worth living for on a quiet park bench. He wasn't just a Hell's Angel anymore. He was a guardian. "Always, little one," Arthur whispered, standing up and taking her hand. Always. What an incredible journey. From a terrifying encounter in the park to a heartwarming story of redemption, loyalty, and a biker's unbreakable promise to his fallen brother. Family isn't always defined by blood. Sometimes, it's defined by the lengths we go to protect one another. If Arthur's dedication touched your heart, please drop a like, share this incredible story with your friends, and subscribe for more powerful real-life dramas.
Hi, my name is Dominant Flame Escrow, the owner and manager of Dominant Flame Escrow. After watching the video, "Are you lost too, Mr. A Girl Asked This Hell's Angel?" his reaction left the park in tears. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was how one innocent question from a child could break through someone's tough exterior so completely. The biker may have looked strong and intimidating on the outside, but that moment revealed a loneliness and humanity underneath that people around him probably never expected to see. I think that's what gave the story its emotional weight. Sometimes the simplest words can touch wounds or memories we spend years trying to hide. Do you think the little girl understood how deeply her question affected him? Or was it the biker himself who finally realized something he'd been avoiding emotionally? And why do you think unexpected emotional moments between strangers can feel so powerful to watch? Stories like this remind us that everyone is carrying something unseen. And sometimes, compassion begins with simply noticing another person. If this story stayed with you emotionally, I'd really love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy biker stories filled with heart, emotion, and unexpected human connection, feel free to like and subscribe, only if you'd like to see more.